Hi, my name is Joshua Furman. I'm the curator of the Houston Jewish History Archive at Rice University. Today is March 31st, 2021, and I'm very excited to be with this esteemed group of very special people who have had an outsized impact on the Houston and Galveston Jewish communities to reflect together and have a conversation about their time at the University of Texas and Texas Hillel in the 1970s. And I'm going to ask each of you to introduce yourselves, starting with Rabbi Jimmy Kessler.
Hi, good morning. I'm Rabbi Jimmy Kessler. I'm a native Houstonian. I went to the old St. Jacinta High School in Houston. And then I went off to the University of Texas. In my day, it wasn't at anywhere. It was just the University of Texas, and it was in Austin. The interesting theory is I may have been the first Jewish kid that went off from Texas to become a rabbi and then came back to Texas to serve as a rabbi. I'm not 100% sure of that, but certainly I'll lay claim to the first Reform rabbi that did it, but I may have been the first. I ended up going to the University of Texas because everybody went to the University of Texas. That's where you were expected to go to find your spouse. And that was a verbal statement passed on amongst Jewish families in those days. My folks belonged to Beth Yeshurun until I was about 12 years old. And then they switched to Temple Emmanuel, where I was subsequently bar mitzvahed and confirmed. And as I say, and then I went off to UT. I was one of those midterm graduates that don't seem to exist very much anymore. I finished in January of 1964, and 5 days later, I was sitting in a class of about 300 kids learning about something called DNA and RNA, which I'd never heard of before. I also, at UT, joined a Jewish fraternity, which was not 100% expected, but somewhat expected in my day. I joined Tau Delta Phi, which has subsequently been sold to AEPI, and no telling what's gone on, but it no longer exists as a fraternity on campus. I will tell you that for my first 2 years, I never darkened the door of Hillel or anything Jewish for that matter. I instead was just a good student and a good frat rat. The interesting part of campus in those days was that it was essentially a party school. Particularly for the guys who were going to Texas A&M in those days, because A&M did not have female students. And so on weekends, there was a large influx of students, not just Jewish ones, obviously, who came to Austin for parties. And of course, fraternities had parties, so we always had a goodly number of those folk who came and participated. My involvement with Hillel began as in my sophomore year in college when my dad died. But otherwise, that was what the university was like. I think people were concerned about being drafted. That seemed to be another significant issue. There was not, I guess, to say the number system yet that did come about when I was an undergraduate, but it wasn't there at first. And your grades were the issue. And the rest of the time it was partying. That was the generation that gave rise to a friend who I've known since I was 9 years old, Kinky Friedman, and his subsequent Texas Jew Boys singing group. And it was just, the kind of simplistic college life that was going on. There were those guys who wanted, and girls, obviously, who wanted to go to medical school. There was that generation of immigrants' grandchildren who were expected to get a degree, so that there was a diploma in the offices of the businesses that had made significant incomes, where the father and the grandfather had no opportunity to go to college, but their grandchild did. And that seemed to be the heart and substance of the business school in those days. And that pretty much was, I think, campus life for me in the early to mid 60s.
Great. Great. Thank you, Rabbi Kessler. We're going to hear now from Nancy Pryzant Picus.
Thank you for the introduction. As Josh said, my name is Nancy Pryzant Picus. I am almost a native Houstonian. I would have been born here if my father had not been in the Naval Reserve, but I got here at 6 weeks old. So I grew up here. My mother was born here. My father was actually born in Willis, Texas. So I have very, very deep roots in this part of Texas. I grew up at Congregation Emmanuel and spent a lot of time in TEFD, the Temple Emmanuel Federation of Temple Youth, the Temple Emmanuel Federation of Temple Youth, and also in TOFD, which was the state and regional. And that was very important to me. I am currently a retired Jewish educator. Actually, that's not true. I'm retired from the day school where I was the director of Jewish learning for 29 years, the Shlenker School. But I am not a retired Jewish educator. I just don't go to work every day at the Shlenker School. I'm still actively involved at the in teaching and in the Jewish community as a whole. I've spent most of my professional life here as a Jewish educator at Congregation Beth Israel, both in the religious school and at the Shlenker School. I've spent time at Congregation Emmanuel in their religious school, and also way back when, in between, I would say at the very early stages of my motherhood as well, when I took off time from everyday employment, I actually worked in Galveston helping to develop curriculum for the two schools together. They had a joint religious school at that point. So that's been my professional involvement in the synagogue, in the life of Jewish Houston.
Great. Nancy, thank you so much. Now let's hear from Rabbi David Rosen.
Thank you, Josh, and it's a real pleasure to be here with my wonderful friends and colleagues. I am a native Houstonian. I was born in Houston in 1951. I was born into Congregation Beth Yeshurun. So yes, I also was born and raised here, left the state for many years, and then came back to Texas. So Jimmy, you and I share that to some extent. I have very fond memories of growing up here in Houston. I was here until I was 16, which means I was just starting high school in those days. High school back then was just 10th, 11th, and 12th grades. And I have very fond memories of growing up at Beth Yeshurun. I remember my father carrying me on his shoulders around the sanctuary on Simchat Torah. I remember Hebrew school for all the years, Hillel High School, which was then a middle school, 2 high school program. And when I was just getting ready to go to Bel Air High School, where all my friends were going, my father yanked us out of Houston and moved us to Dallas. And it took me months before I could actually speak to my father again. He dragged me to a new town where I knew nobody. And he realized when I got there how unhappy I was. So he signed me up to be in a AZA chapter in Dallas. He drove me to the first meeting. He walked into the meeting. He had already called the president of the AZA chapter, which is, of course, no end of embarrassment. Anything he could do to get me involved in something rather than just anger at having been pulled out of Houston. But in Houston, I had a wonderful second career, if you will, second opportunity. That's where I met Lee. We were both in AZA, Henry Monsky AZA, which was a very prominent chapter at the time. It was sort of the it was a sister chapter to Cyrus Adler AZA here in Houston. And so we did a number of activities together where we would come from Dallas to Houston and they'd come from Houston to Dallas. And I thrived in AZA. It was a wonderful opportunity for me to learn how to come out of my shell, be more of a social person and interact with people, develop some early leadership skills, not much, but some, you know. And in AZA, I started a newspaper. I started I forgot what it was called, the AZA BBG News or something like that. And it was just something I developed with Bernie Klein, who was the regional director of B'nai B'rith in those days. And he thought it'd be great, let's have a newspaper, talk about all the different chapters and everything. So I loved reading newspapers. As a child, I used to play creating little newspapers at home on my typewriter. So, I mean, I love the idea of actually editing a newspaper, putting it together. And of course, that set of skills went on to help me when I got to the University of Texas. But at in the high school level, I started getting this little inkling of religious sensibility. I somehow became religious chairman of my AZA chapter, which meant that I was responsible every month for putting together some kind of a service at one of the synagogues or something before everybody went out on a date and had a good time. But it sort of alerted me to the possibility that there might be more to being Jewish than just being proud, that there was actually content and substance to it. And that would, of course, be more fully developed when I made the decision to go to University of Texas. I'll close with that. There was no decision to go to the University of Texas. As Jimmy said, I was sent there. I have no recollection of even applying there. I think my dad and my mom took care of everything. There was no choice. There was no going up to campus to look it over. There was no plan B, C, D. In those days, pretty much, if you wanted to go to the University of Texas and you were a resident of the state of Texas, and you had what I think a minimum of C grade or something, I don't know if you even needed that. I remember one day my dad said, we're going to start packing up now, you're moving to Austin. And that was it. I went to Austin. And got put right in the middle of the campus. My parents drove away. I can still remember to this day them driving away and me standing on the street, just looking and waving and wondering, what the heck am I going to do now? You know? So it was like a little city. It was like a city. It's huge. It's huge. It was huge then, even larger now. And I did not know what I was going to do, where I was going to go. And I started off in a fraternity, not because I wanted to be, but I got pushed. And it turned out to be a bad mix. I was not a party person. I really wasn't a fraternity type, if you can say such a thing. And so that didn't last. And I needed a place to hone my skills and to do something that would be more pertinent to me personally, which led into what followed. But that's pretty much how I got to where I got.
Great. Thank you, Rabbi Rosen. And now he's been very patient. Lee Wunsch, please.
Thank you. Thank you. It's good to be with everyone. I, unlike those who spoke before me, I am not a native Houstonian. I grew up in Dallas. I'm actually the first generation Texan in my family because my parents moved to Texas in 1951 from Brooklyn, New York, because of a business opportunity for my father. My oldest sister actually was born in Brooklyn. So I'm the first generation Texan in my immediate family. I attended, my parents were members of the big conservative synagogue in Dallas, which is likely what drew me eventually to Beth Yeshurun when I came to Houston. I was active in AZA. That's where David Rosen and I met a few years ago. And I had a very normative growing up experience like any Jewish family in the 1950s and 60s. Until there was a decision to be made about where to go to college. And like several have said, there was no choice, no options, nothing. You were going to the University of Texas. My oldest sister had gone out of state, and because we were also, my parents were not, did not attend college. It was like a lot of things as you're raising your kids, there was a lot of uncertainty. My sister ended up going out of state, and they weren't prepared to send their second child out of state. So everything came together, and I ended up at the University of Texas in the fall of 1970, and had somewhat of a similar experience where they brought me, got me to the dorm I was going to live in eventually for 2 years, waved goodbye, and they were off. And quite frankly, it was a challenging experience because the university is so large. The dorm I was living in was just in its second year, virtually new. And to that point in the history of the university, the largest dorm on campus. And it was a challenging first few months, maybe first couple of years, but eventually I settled in.
Great. Thanks to all of you for those introductions. I'm curious, before we get to talking about UT Hillel in those days, I'd love to hear, as a lecturer at a university, I'm biased, I guess. I'd love to hear a story or two about a favorite professor or class that you took that really had an impact on you, that changed the way you thought about the world or about yourself. Who has a story about that they'd like to tell? Go ahead, Rabbi Rosen.
No question about it. One professor in particular definitely impacted me and moved me closer to what eventually would be my career. That was Professor Isaac Silverschlag. I'm sure Jimmy remembers him well. Lee may well too. I'm not sure, Nancy, if he was still teaching when you were there.
I don't think so.
And he would be a surprising choice if you were to meet him. He was an older gentleman, very Germanic in his manner. He always came to class with very dapper suit and tie, and I mean, he was just so unlike any other professor at the university. But what struck me about Professor Silberschlag was his course was called Jewish Contributions to Western Civilization. And it was basically a survey course of Jewish history. And it opened my eyes. I'd never read a book of Jewish history. I thought I knew what being Jewish was. I knew about all the holidays. But here was a professor who, on an academic level, on a scholarly level, referring to other texts and books, opened my world in terms of the history, the grandeur, the highs, the lows, the majesty of Jewish history and life and literature. It was quite a course, and he was very didactic in the way he spoke. He was very, very proper and formal. But what grabbed me was that, my God, this man is brilliant in an area of study that I didn't know any brilliant people. You know what I mean? You have professors of science and chemistry and culture, but here's a Jewish guy who speaks with such authority and richness, and it overwhelmed me in a most positive way and encouraged me to actually read the books on the syllabus for the test, but also because I was learning about myself. And that, I think, had a major impact on me going forward.
I actually had a very different kind of experience. And the person I'm going to tell you about, and this experience for me was actually very personal, but it affected how I led my career. I breezed through high school. I never studied. I never had anything but A's. And my first English class, I was an English major, and my first English class, the first paper I wrote, I got a D. And I had never in my life seen something like that on a paper that I had produced. And I went to the professor. I remember his name. He actually was from Rice University. He was a postdoc from Rice. And I talked to him about it. And I said, what is this? What, how has this happened? And he opened my mind to how I really should be thinking and what I can do. And it made me very humble. It's probably the best thing that ever happened to me, because I really, the best thing academically at any rate that ever happened to me, because I had to be humble. I had to learn that I could do this. And I think that really affected me as I went forward as a teacher and as a learner too, just that there's so much to learn and so many different ways to do it and so many ways to show what you learn. And that has always really been important to me in my career as a Jewish educator. And later when we talk about it, I can talk about how I became that Jewish educator. But
okay. Why don't we go back to Rabbi Kessler now? And Jimmy, tell us about how it was that you went from the Hebrew Union College as a newly ordained rabbi back to Austin, and what you found when you got back to campus as the new Hillel rabbi.
I went to rabbinical school as a lark. To just follow the kind of story that Nancy just shared, I was the president of the fraternity, and I was told that the new Hillel rabbi was coming to visit. And so I put on my button-down shirt. They had just come out. That was the thing to wear. And I went down into the living room, and there was this guy sitting in shorts, sneakers with no socks, a pullover shirt, a goatee, dark sunglasses, and you should pardon me, Josh, your cap. And I stuck my hand out and I said, "Hi, I'm Jimmy Kessler. I'm the president of Taudel." And he stands up and he says, "Hi, I'm Mickey Sills. I'm the new Hillel rabbi." Well, you could have knocked me over with a 10-foot pole. I mean, I was used to Rabbi Malov and Rabbi Kahn in Houston, these guys you rarely saw without their coat on. He turned out to be the advisor I was looking for. My dad had just died. And one day he said to me, you have the soul of a rabbi, not a physician. You ought to go to rabbinical school. So I tried rabbinical school as a lark because my roommates gigged me about it. And the frightening and desirable thing was that it was interesting. It was stuff I had never studied before. I had never heard about, as David experienced with Dr. Silberschlag. At any rate, you get to be a senior and you figure, what are you going to do? Well, all my classmates seemed to know they were looking to be assistant rabbis somewhere. And I had no idea what to do now that I was getting this diploma. And all of a sudden, I noticed a list had been posted on the bulletin board by the National Hillel Foundation, which in those days was B'nai B'rith. And it listed the University of Texas. And I applied for the job, thinking that number one, I didn't like cold weather or snow, so that would bring me home. And number two, I figured if I would fail at rabbiing, there's bound to be somebody's daddy who owned a business I could go to work for that I'd gone to college or high school with. And lo and behold, I got hired right away. And my classmate, who was from San Antonio, Gene Levy, waited for months to hear. What I later learned was that no one in the country wanted to go to Austin but me. The reason was, as you asked, what was it like? The building was in terrible shape. It's not the current building, obviously, that's relatively new, as it were, but it was an older building, but built to be a Hillel foundation. It was in not very good shape, and the foundation was broke. It had a notice that within the next 10 days, if the bill for the utilities was not paid, they were going to turn off the utilities. And there was a drawer full of unpaid bills and no money in the bank and an adding machine that did not work. And I thought, this is a wonderful thing to encounter. Fortunately, there were two delightful people on not on campus, but in Austin. One was Tom Friedman, a professor of ed psych at UT. He was Kinky Friedman's dad. And he ran a camp for Jewish kids, Echo Hill Ranch. And the other was a man named Milton Smith, whose wife had been the International B'nai B'rith Women's president and a very wealthy family, furniture manufacturers. And I called Uncle Tom and I said, I don't know what to do. And he said, I'll get back with you. And so he and Milton Smith went to the bank that Milton was the chairman of the board of and borrowed $30,000, put it in the Hillel checking account so I could pay all the bills off, buy a new adding machine, and allow me to begin to try and do some kind of programming. Nobody came to Hillel for the first month. No one darkened the door. But I was a very lucky guy, and I'm sitting in the presence of the two people who were my instant luck. David and Lee were roommates, and they both contacted me while I was still a student, wanting to know what was I going to do to change Jewish life on campus. But fortunately, they were not just people who stood on the outside, but became involved, got active. And I did what I thought I needed to do to go out and try and get people interested. Since I had been a fraternity guy, I went to the Jewish fraternities and Jewish sororities. And fortunately, it seemed like one or two people from each of those groups got interested. I became very infamous or famous, however you would like to look at it, for teaching Bible courses. They were easy A electives. You could take only 3 courses, 9 hours. I didn't get paid. Hillel didn't get paid. They ultimately shut those down just because the students had to pay building fees, but the university just collected that money and put it away. But I shortly determined that the best way to get people in the building was also to make that an easy A course. And so it rapidly grew from about 15 or 20 Jewish kids to 100 each semester. And I taught 2 courses a semester. Clearly, the majority were not Jewish kids, but they heard that as the Baptist minister said, the rabbi down the block is the easy A if that's who you're looking for. So Hillel became for me my major project to try and restore, to try and find money. I learned about schnorring money early on. If I came in a coat and tie, students knew that I was headed off to some other city. I was the only Hillel rabbi in Texas, and B'nai B'rith expected me to visit at least A&M and sort of at SMU, but not exactly at SMU, but in Dallas, there was a Hillel activity going on. And so I was expected to travel around and see those things. And of course, to raise money to keep the doors open. But with time, Hillel became, an interesting place to do crazy things. I put in a pool table. Actually, I got a pool table donated, but we put in a pool table. I think probably the one that I was most infamous for, aside from the Bible courses, that Darrell Royal sent the college jocks to, was I told students I was coming to a Texas football game on a Saturday night, and I bought a student ticket, and I brought a little bottle of wine, pill bottle of wine. I brought some nutmeg and aluminum foil and 3 birthday candles. And I did Havdalah in the stands and reported to National B'nai B'rith that 68,000 some odd hundred students attended my Havdalah service. No one ever said anything about that. began to realize they probably never read the reports. But I will tell you that, and I'll speak later about it, Hillel for me was, in spite of the things that drove me a little nutsy, Hillel was just a wonderful experience, a delight. And clearly you allow me to sit this morning with three of the people that helped make it that way.
Sure. Thanks, Rabbi Kessler. I want to turn things over to Lee in a second to hear about his early impressions. But we need to give people a sense of time. So just very, very quickly, Jimmy, when did you come to UT as the director? What year was it?
I came in 1972, that summer. I stayed for 3 years. Candidly, I got burnt out trying to raise money. The budget was $29,500, $9,000 of which was my salary. And the other 21 is what B'nai B'rith, or the other 20, I should say, was what B'nai B'rith gave us. And I had to raise the rest. And it just was really frustrating because of the fact that the programming, or the possibility for programming, grew. Federations had not yet been giving money to Hillel, and that's what sent me on my way.
Got it. Okay, thank you. All right, Lee, tell us when you came to UT, what year it was, and some of your first impressions and memories of Jewish life on campus in Hillel.
Okay. I arrived on campus in September 1970 as a very lost kid. As I said earlier, overwhelmed by the size of the campus and by the number of people. And of course, the first day I walked into a class with 600-700 people, you know, when you're used to a high school class of 25 to 30 students, it took me months to figure out what the heck I needed to do. Eventually, sometime during my freshman year, I wandered into Hillel. I can't remember if Mickey Sills was still the director. I'm not sure exactly when the transition was, but certainly by the beginning of my sophomore year, there was no director. And one of the faculty, Jewish faculty, Stephen Ross, who was a professor of history, became the de facto Hillel director, faculty advisor, whatever the case was. So a lot of what happened in those first 2 years, number one, it was very focused on what I'll just generally term religious events, Shabbat services, high holiday services, the kind of broad spectrum of programming that was on in Hillel's today. It didn't exist back then. And of course, as Jimmy has articulated, the building was, as students, we probably didn't appreciate it at the time, but the building was pretty beat up. I think it had been built in the mid-40s. And, but, you know, we made use of it. And, you know, over the course of particularly those first couple of years, the Jewish students began to mobilize and do various things without the serious support of a Hillel director. That obviously occurred when Jimmy arrived later. And it was a mixture of getting involved, at least for me, in some of the political activities on campus and some other things related to Israel activity.
Okay, great, thanks. Rabbi Rosen, how about you? When did you come to UT, and what were some of your first impressions?
I came to UT in the fall of 1969, the year before Lee. Took me a while to make my way to the Hillel. It was only a block away from campus, where it still is, of course, so I had to pass it almost every day for one reason or another. But it was not an inviting place. I went a few times. The rabbi was Mickey Sills, who Jimmy spoke about earlier. He had a very nonconformist approach to life, to Judaism, and it wasn't appealing to me. And so I didn't really have a sustained involvement with the organization then. The building was dingy and dark. The whole thing there was just not appealing to me. I came from Beth Yeshurun, which was a very dynamic, large, full. And then in high school, for 3 years, I'd gone to Shereth Israel, which is also a very large, well-planned, bright, you know, congregation, and to go to the Hillel there, it seemed very much like an afterthought on campus, and even compared unfavorably with the other Christian centers, which were all over campus, which were very appealing, and there seemed to be more joy in them. I didn't go to them, but I knew friends who would go to them, and they spoke very enthusiastically about what they experienced. Hillel did not provide that. And it wasn't until Jimmy came in my third year that I became very, very intensely drawn back to Hillel. The building was still no better than it had been, but Jimmy brought a light to the building. He brought an energy. And I remember the first time I met Jimmy, I was like dumbstruck. I had never met or seen a rabbi like Jimmy Kessler. Okay, my rabbi had been William Maliv here at Beth Yeshurun until I was 16, and he was a godlike figure. You know, he walked around in robes, it seemed to me, and I would see him on Shabbat morning, and he would have a day's growth of beard, and it was like white on his face, and he had this white hair, this huge yarmulke. I don't know what to call these things. Maybe you can give me the name for it. It's like a crown, and a big white robe and a sprawling tallis. This is a man you stayed away from. This is my idea of a rabbi. And when I lived in Dallas for 3 years, the rabbis were in transition then. There was a flux going on at Cherith Israel. So Jimmy comes in, and the first thing out of his mouth was, "Anybody want pizza?" I thought, rabbis eat pizza? And Jimmy was, of course, a major influence in my life and in my career. But that takes us to the next step. The only thing I would say was, it was because of what I found at UT when I came, those first 2 years, that I felt I needed to do something to help create some kind of Jewish community for me personally. I couldn't find it. I couldn't put my arms around it. And that's how I ended up starting the Jewish Student newspaper, frankly. This garnished kid who knew nobody knew him, had the chutzpah to start the Jewish newspaper on campus. But it reflected in a way my state of desperation, that I felt something needed to pull us all together so we could find each other.
Sure, and we'll hear about that in a few minutes. Go ahead, Nancy.
Well, I was at UT. My time at UT was Jimmy's time at UT. I graduated in 3 years. I had a summer in there as well. But I'm going to start with my impressions of the building. I think I must have walked into a different building, either that, or it was after Jimmy had gotten his $30,000 and paid the bills and done something. But the building never put me off. I always felt comfortable in it from the moment that I walked in. And I hit the Hillel pretty quickly. I went pretty much at the very beginning of my time on campus. And part of that, I lived in Kinsolving, which was the women's dorm that was a Texas-owned, UT-owned dorm. And I was incensed to find out that I could not have Kiddush wine and light candles, and to find out that I had to dress up for Sunday lunch because everybody was going to be at church, but nobody was going to dress up for Friday night dinner for me. And so I don't even know if you knew about this, Jimmy, going on, but I together with my friends on the floor, who most of them were not Jewish, but a couple of them were, we petitioned our RA to be able to have some Kiddush wine and to light Shabbat candles. And I got it. And it was, of course, the wine had to stay in her refrigerator, which I didn't care. That was fine with me. But so Hillel was a place where I could be Jewish, and that it was hard for me to do that at Kinsolving. I actually did have a mezuzah that I stuck up on my door somehow or another. it was just a different feel. The building for me was always comfortable. It was sort of a haven. I remember still the chairs, the mid-century modern chairs. I didn't know them as mid-century modern then, but they were comfortable for me. And even though they were probably too big for me, I just, remember walking in and never feeling like it was a show place, but never feeling like it wasn't a place that welcomed me. So.
Great, thank you so much. Let's talk now, Rabbi Rosen and Lee, more about the Texas Jewish Voice, the newspaper that you created. You started to say a little bit about the impetus for it being a lack of connectedness to other Jewish students on campus. Talk a little bit more about that, and then the actual tachlis, right, the nuts and bolts of starting a newspaper.
The newspaper was started in my second year, and there was no rabbi at the Hillel, so there was no organizational center for Jewish life at the time. The fraternities and the rest of the Jewish community were separate from each other. The fraternities were a dominant force socially, and there wasn't a whole lot going on Jewishly. Even the Hillel was very quiet. And so how did an independent person like me meet anybody? I wasn't in the Hillel system. I've always been a very straight shooter and very unconventional in that sense, personal. Wasn't a drinker. I mean, it was very hard, very difficult. So I started the newspaper really on a whim, just an idea, maybe using what I knew about making newspapers, maybe I could pull something together that would sort of bring everyone together. And I don't know how I got money for the first issue, but I do recall getting in my car and driving to Dallas to talk to the Federation director. I think his name was Jack Kravitz. Jimmy, am I correct in that?
Yes.
Jack Kravitz was very receptive. He was the CEO, executive director of the Federation. He's very receptive, and I didn't need much money. I mean, I needed, maybe $1,000. I mean, I wasn't getting paid for it. All I needed was somebody to pay the printer bill. And then he suggested I go down to Houston and talk to the director there, whose name was Al Goldstein, if I'm remembering correctly. Does that sound right?
Yep.
Yeah.
So these two men both gave me what I needed to put out the first issue or two, just to see if it was well received or not. And basically, the first issue, if you look at it now, makes me kind of wince a little bit, because trying to bring everyone together, Lee will know what I'm going to say, but half the issue was photographs, big pictures of the sorority, incoming sorority girls, new members of the chapters. Okay, no fraternity pictures, just sorority girls. And why did I do that? Because I figured everybody would read it. I mean, the girls would read it to see themselves, and the boys would read it to see the girls. And then around it, I had little stories about things happening on campus, which I just picked up from who knows where. And it was very fluffy, very fluffy. And the first issue sold out, which means everybody took all the free copies. There were probably a lot of the girls who sent copies home, to share with their families. But I didn't know what else to put in a Jewish paper. I didn't really have a lot of role models in that regard, and I wanted something that the kids would read. And so it continued along for a while. But what ultimately changed it was when I got a call from National HJHA, which I had only heard of, telling me that they were putting together a trip to Israel for Jewish newspaper campus editors. I didn't know there were any other Jewish campus newspapers, frankly. We had no internet then. And how would I know? But it turned out there were about 25 or 30 campuses around the country that had Jewish student newspapers. And they invited me to come to Israel free of charge for 10 days. And first, I couldn't decide whether I should go or not. I had a date with my girlfriend for the Cotton Bowl, and I remember there was a Professor Nate Loshak, if I got that right, Jimmy?
Yep.
Yeah.
So Nate Loshak was the campus faculty advisor. He had nothing to do officially with the newspaper. It was still very independent. But I remember him calling me up and asking me, what was I hesitating? UJA had called him and asked, why was this kid stalling about going to Israel? And when he found out the reason, he said to me, David, I will move heaven and earth to shut down that paper and put you out of business if you turn this trip down to Israel. You're going. Well, a faculty advisor telling me anything scared the bejesus out of me. So I ended up going to Israel, and it changed my life. When I came back, you look at the issues of the University Jewish Voice after I went to Israel. It was a much more serious paper, no more sorority girl pictures. It was all really tachlis. It was really substantive. And that's when I needed writers. That's when I needed people to work with me and help me because there was so much I didn't know. And Lee was, my friend from high school, and he was also involved with me in Jewish life on campus. We were very close, have been close since high school. And he became my right hand, and it was really he helped me so much, and we together, I think, got it through. We found other campus kids who wanted to work and take pictures, and then raising money was always an issue. The other federations in Texas were not interested in helping. And their attitude was that University of Texas is in Austin, and it was the responsibility of the Austin Federation to take care of anything happening in Austin. And I would stress to them that it's their kids that are in Austin, it's Houston kids, San Antonio kids, Lubbock kids, but nobody was interested except Dallas and Houston. And they reached a point finally in my senior year where they just couldn't get the justification or support to continue the paper. And I became so frustrated with it, like Jimmy, I just became so frustrated. All I was doing was raising money, and I was a student. I still had to study and do courses and everything else. But the paper, I think, it served an important function, and it got better and better, thankfully, because of people like Lee and some really wonderful other kids who, my roommates, we all pitched in, and everybody helped. But doing newspapers in those days was not like it is today. You do it on a computer, you lay out the pages. We had to actually get the typeset and galleys, cut it out, and get some paste and paste down the columns and get the pictures. And it was very, very labor intensive, but that's what it was. But it was an experience which, of course, obviously had a tremendous impact on me personally and my career going forward. And the Hillel with Jimmy, when Jimmy came, he offered us the cloakroom at the Hillel. Do you remember that, Jimmy?
Oh, yes.
He offered us the cloakroom, literally a cloakroom that had a door where you got your coat and gave out the tab, the receipt, and it was just a place to put a little tiny table and a typewriter, and it became part of Hillel at that point for the last year or two, and I think it made a difference. And but it was it was part of my experience that I will always treasure.
Great. Lee, do you want to talk about your work on the paper and maybe?
Yeah, interesting. And Josh, this, in my first months of the pandemic, my at-home projects, I discovered many issues boxed up in my garage that are now the property of the Houston Jewish Archives. And, you look back at this stuff and you realize that once you got past the sorority pictures, which honestly I can't remember, but David was the editor. So there's a real sense of history of Jewish life on campus and Jewish life around the world that was impacting campus. And of course, at the time, and it was, and some people still consider it to be, the Jewish Telegraphic Agency was the major kind of Jewish news source that fed information to Jewish community newspapers, not necessarily student newspapers around the country. So you can see several articles that were clipped from the from JTA files, but also things, as David said, that were written by students about all kinds of issues. And if you track the history of Jewish life during those few years that the paper was being published, it will also track what was going on campus regarding all the issues that I know we'll have a few minutes to talk about. It's worth noting, because it may otherwise not come up, and it should be part of this conversation, is when David and I lived together, his senior year, my junior year, David's father, I think from his business, but David could clarify, David was using an old IBM Selectric typewriter with those, I don't know what they're exactly called, those little font balls that you could take out of the typewriter and change the font. And that's what, if I recall, at least when I was more active with it, we were writing the stories before they went through all the process that David described. And you know, you didn't have any, it wasn't like a word processor. You had to put that white stuff. If you made a mistake, otherwise you had to start the article all over. So it was in addition to the Jewish content and this need that it met, it was a learning process, certainly for me, in terms of writing and just the mechanics. When you got past using that typewriter, which you were pounding on the keys with the keys hitting the paper.
Josh, can I add one thing? Just a little.
Go ahead.
A little what we call Hatima, a seal to this, but I graduated in 1973. In 1996, I came back to Houston as Rabbi Beth Yeshurun, and I started going to Austin to visit our Beth Yeshurun college students, okay, just to take them out to dinner and schmooze with them. And our first program dinner was at the Hillel. And it was the same Hillel where I had gone to school. The building was still the old building. And I remember going into the library just to look through the building. And Jimmy knows what I'm going to say. And I saw something in one of the shelves way down at the end of the library. And I go and I look down there. All the back issues of the University Jewish Voice were all there, all in nice boxes, and a few of them were loose. They'd been sitting there for 20 years. Over 20, 23, 24 years. And so I was able to reclaim some of the copies because I had, gone my way and didn't have any with me. But so the paper kind of hung around, although I think there was an attempt to restart it, but I'm not positive.
Yeah, I think maybe Jeff Lefkowitz may have revived it briefly.
Oh, that's nice.
Later. I want to turn now to the topic of the campus environment in the 1970s. And you think about everything that was going on at the time, Nixon, the Watergate scandal, the Vietnam War, the Yom Kippur War, the Munich Olympics, just what a tumultuous time in American history and Jewish history that was. And I would love to hear about, your perspective on all that as a college student. What was happening on campus in terms of activism, engagement, in terms of anti-Israel pushback, and how did you respond? What were you active in at that time? And anybody who wants to start can feel free.
Well, I would say the University of Texas, I learned years ago, and I think it's still the case, that things in our country in terms of politics and culture usually first happen on the East Coast, then they go to the West Coast. Eventually they find their way to Texas. So in some ways, I think Texas, UT was a little slow on the uptick, but certainly by the time I arrived on campus, there was huge amount of activity related to the politics around Vietnam, because the war was still going on. Certainly civil rights issues were being engaged with in terms of activity. There wasn't, quite frankly, a lot of what I'll call pro-Israel Jewish issue activity, at least in the public domain, because most of it was happening inside the walls of Hillel and not on the campus. That slowly began to change. I think the first, in terms of my 4 years there, the first major uproar was when the Israeli athletes were killed at the Olympics in the fall of '72. And those of us that, just as general students, were involved in some of the anti-Vietnam War stuff, it triggered something in us that caused us to want to, begin to make statements, however those statements were made. And of course, that was followed almost a year later by the Yom Kippur War. And the Soviet Jewry movement, of course, had started in the early to mid '60s and also found its way to campus. We were very small numbers, the Jewish students. I think in those years there were 45 to 50,000 students, undergraduate students. And I don't know how many Jewish students there were there at the time, 2,000 or 3,000, maybe 4, I'm not sure. But the number of us that were actively engaged was pretty small. Yet I feel like because of the environment around protests and lots of shouting, we were able to make statements about support for Israel and Soviet Jewry and some of the other issues. And there were speakers that came to campus along the way, either sponsored by some students with or without Hillel support, and they kind of stimulated a lot of activity. And to me, what was, I think, again, part of the learning experience outside of the classroom is that many of the leaders of the anti-war movement and the civil rights movement were Jewish students, most of whom had little engagement with Jewish student life. And many of them were anti-Israel. So you had this clash going on a pretty frequent basis between the Jewish students involved in the anti-war movement and those of us involved in the pro-Israel movement. And even though we shared views on certain issues, there were other issues we completely were disparate. And it's interesting because today when I talk to students on campuses, they tell me the same thing. There are issues today that students are dealing with that are put them in class with Jewish students who are focused on pro-Israel stuff. And it's a struggle to figure out how to deal with it all. And that was definitely the case back in the years I was on campus.
Wow, Nancy.
I want to look at that from the other point of view. I got to campus in 1972, and I was a very naive 18-year-old. And I remember, and I told you about, my stand in, for getting my Kiddush wine, but being where I lived at Kinsolving, I had I got to see a lot of the other side of the reaction. After the election in 1972, I remember people on our floor going down the halls chanting 4 more years, 4 more years. I was just horrified. And it was scary to me almost. And so I was never politically inclined in those years, and I was certainly never politically active. But my sense of who I was as a Jew, I actually think probably got solidified because where I lived, I was the other. So, and of course, Hillel always supported me in not feeling like the other. When I felt like the other, I'd just go and see Jimmy, or I'd just go into the building. And I had the advantage of being able to do that my entire time that I lived in Austin.
Great. Rabbi Kessler, can you give us the director's perspective on those years? I mean, how do you counsel students who are engaging with these issues. And I'd love to hear from you too, Jimmy, about interfaith relations on campus, your relationships with other campus faith leaders.
It was a difficult time for me as well, because I'd gone to rabbinical school with 36 people in my class, 34 of whom had burned their draft cards. And I was a goody two shoes. I didn't burn my draft card. And when they picketed the federal courthouse against the war, and they were all arrested, the president of the rabbinical school refused to bail them out. And so one of the professors grabbed me to go with him to the jail where he bailed them out, and I could identify them. So my place was trying to figure out, where did I fit into this kind of scene? For the 6-Day War, for example, Hillel had a bomb threat. My life was threatened. Let's kill that Hillel rabbi. And that left an intriguing kind of experience to be dealt with. It's when I learned that there are all kinds of ways of getting protection for Jews who want to gather together. On the side of the Interfaith group, the university decided that it was going to create a concentration in religion, but it did not include Christianity. And so I was approached by several members of the Ministerial Alliance to be the designated go see the president of the school. And I did. And said, you know, it would look terrible for Texas, and I'm a UT grad, to have a concentration in religion and not include Christianity. So they changed their tune. I will tell you that apropos of that as well was that the Mrs. O'Hare, some of the people who will hear this will remember, she was the atheist in America. Mrs. O'Hare on the Johnny Carson show announced that she was going to open an atheist Bible chair at the University of Texas. And the president of the school called in the middle of the following week and said, Rabbi, you're going to be our designated contact with Mrs. O'Hare. Figuring, he said, that she'd treat a rabbi with a little more respect than she would treat any minister. Those kind of things just sort of came my way. And for somebody who had no training in seminary about it, let alone being a zoology and chemistry major as an undergrad, I knew how to deal with it. I think the other, which just again was, there's a wonderful quote that I'm sure David and I studied, and Nancy and Lee may have as well, from the Talmud that says, God smiles on women, children, and fools. And I always thought I was in the third category, because when the building had its bomb threat, I decided to find out who the Arab student advisor was. And he and I met at a truck stop. Now, today that truck stop's in the middle of Austin, but in those days it was out at the end of the city. And we met one night and said, this is crazy. It's just not really the right thing to do. So he had a meeting with the Arab students and said, you will not do this. If I find out you are threatening the Jewish kids or Hillel, I'll call the INS and have you deported. I got the Israeli students together and I said, look, we are the people who believe in seichel, good common sense. Let's use our seichel, not our big mouths, and let's leave that all alone. That opened for me, all three of those kind of crazy things opened for me a lot of areas of conversation. But, you know, the other reality was that each of these things had its own particular issue. For instance, the war in Vietnam. A part that was tied to that was not only picketing and protesting the war, but there were students who showed up at Hillel who did not want to go to Vietnam. And the question was, what could they do about that? All of those, for me, became very personal issues for each youngster. It was sort of like, I guess it's the Jewish mother in me. What could I do to solve their problem? The nice part, I will tell you, is that I never felt like Hillel had to organize the thing. I only felt that Hillel needed to be there as the support, the place to meet, the underpinning that could help people accomplish what they were setting out to accomplish. And as I say, the three folk that you have here with me are the ones who really kind of found answers to what worked for the kids. As I say, I looked, as I reflected back on this conversation, when you mentioned having it, Nancy's suggestion, it struck me that it wasn't so much that Hillel had to do it, as Hillel had to be the support mechanism for students who wanted to do these things.
Yeah.
But Hillel was the impetus for those students to do some of the things we did. Our programming, the things, I mean, I have a horrible memory for detail, but I remember clearly some of the speakers we had, some of the things we did in the building that had nothing to do with Hillel or anything religious. I was there every Monday night for folk dancing, or whatever night it was. And I was there for Israeli dancing, and I was there for Shabbat services. But also, as I became more involved in this, I became more aware of the things we could do. The programming that we did, I learned at Hillel that if you can, you always supply food. It brings people in. That worked for me my entire professional life. It still does. But being at Hillel and knowing that we could do things allowed us to really put together some great stuff. My senior year, we did the Jewish Identity Week between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaAtzmaut. And every night we had a different kind of program. We had a movie, we had speakers, we had all sorts of things that empowered us. The people that took on different parts of it, we were able to do things because we had the backing of Hillel.
Great. Were there other particularly memorable programs or events that you could remember either attending or ones that you organized?
Don't ask me. I'm really terrible at remembering, but I remember that one particularly. I remember making falafel for Yom HaAtzmaut. It just, but it just, I liked being there. So that's
Josh, I would say one of the seminal events, at least during my time, was when Rabbi Meir Kahana,
yes,
who I had no idea who he was at the time, came to campus. I'm not sure exactly which of the 4 years, but he was actually invited, if I recall, Jimmy, you can correct me, by a couple of students that had some connection to him. And of course, I later learned in the weeks before he actually showed up who he was. He came and he was very controversial even then. This is before he did things that really made him controversial. And he spoke on campus, not at Hillel, at the Student Union building. There were easily 500-600 people there. Some of the Jewish students that were active on campus and active in Hillel were standing in front of the stage to protect him, if you will. And a lot of Jewish students that were involved in the anti-war activities and so forth, who were not supporters of Israel, were in the audience and screaming at him. And I'll never forget this exchange between Rabbi Kahana and these Jewish students when they said, and I don't know what prompted it, they were Jewish and proud to be Jewish, but they were against what was going on in Israel and so forth and so on. And his response to them is, of course you're Jewish, but you have no idea what it means. I think it at least for me, it changed the way I thought about what it means to be Jewish. And of course, these are the early years after the 6-Day War, when Jewish pride was really sparked, and just the issues around what does it mean to be a proud Jew. I think he really focused on it, and it led me to read a bunch of his books. And even though I've long ago kind of pushed him aside, and of course he was assassinated in the early mid-90s, but because of his really right-wing, far right-wing views after he made Aliyah, I long ago kind of pushed him out of my way of thinking. But at the time, he likely was the most unbelievable speaker I'd ever heard. Now, of course, college years, you're still naive, you're still young, you don't know anything about the world. So maybe that had a lot to do with the influence.
But I remember actually walking down the drag with you one day, talking about it, how it had influenced you. So that was already, because I didn't hear him. I wasn't here at the, I wasn't at UT Austin then, but I remember the conversation that you and I had about it.
Let's just talk a little bit as we start to wind down, but I want to give everyone a forum to talk about anti-Semitism on campus, because all of you have gone on to become Jewish communal professionals. And one of the hot topics that just won't seem to go away in the last couple of decades is anti-Semitism on campus. So in your time at UT in the 1970s, was there anti-Semitism on campus? Was it something that you perceived as a problem at that time, or is this, in your view, a more recent phenomenon?
I think there was anti-Semitism on campus when we were there. I remember being in a class, for example, when some student made some comment about Jews. First time I'd ever heard such a thing. But the real test for anti-Semitism in my life at campus was I had an anti-Semitic professor. And I didn't know how to deal with it. I'd never had a professor like that. It had to do with the newspaper, believe it or not, the University Jewish Voice. He was the dean of the School of Journalism. He was an older male, and we had to do a project in the School of Communication, and my area was journalism at the time. And I remember presenting the idea of the University Jewish newspaper because I thought that'd be a good project that I could also get credit for since I was doing it already. He worked against me the whole time. He finally told me he wasn't going to accept any of what I had done for any credit whatsoever. He said the paper did not meet the standards of journalism. It did not meet this. It did not meet that. Poor this, poor that. I had enough awareness of what a newspaper should look like and how it should be edited and how it should be laid out and what made it a responsible, professional looking newspaper, to know that certainly it was possible and easy to criticize parts of it, but he was so dismissive of it and of me. And the way he spoke to me, and as the dean of the school, I really couldn't challenge him. But in my heart, the only explanation I could come up with is this man is anti-Semitic. I mean, he was approving projects that were far less substantial and far less merit to them by any objective criterion. And as I dealt with him, I just became aware that here and there throughout campus there was that kind of I don't know, white, old-fashioned, attitude that just kind of leaked through periodically. Did I see it expressed in a way that the ADL would count these things as evidence of anti-Semitism? I don't know that I would. I'm not sure we could point to that. Maybe my colleagues and classmates could. But it did leave a mark on me. It did leave a mark on me.
Yeah, I would say a lot of it, at least for me, was manifested as anti-Israel behavior and things that were said, not too dissimilar to some what is still happening today, but kind of the out and out anti-Semitism, which I honestly had never experienced as a kid, even though I grew up in a largely non-Jewish neighborhood in Dallas. And the schools I went to, I was, one of a handful of Jewish kids. I really never, on campus, experienced the kind of anti-Semitism David is describing. But it was mostly related to a lot of the anti-Israel stuff, which got pretty vicious after the killing of the Israeli athletes, and definitely when the Yom Kippur War broke out in October of '73.
And for me, I felt that it was more ignorance than anything. I had a roommate whose parents had never really interacted with a Jewish person. And the roommate and I actually got along really well, and we were very respectful of each other and of each other's religions. But it just, more than anything, it was ignorance. And, I did my thing with trying to be an educator about it. So
I think what was one of the things that was interesting is you could, and of course, we all of us look back on these days, you could, in those 4 years, I could begin to see the splintering of the traditional Jewish Black alliance that was kind of the foundation, or at least at the core of the civil rights movement in the 60s. And by the early 70s, you could already see it splintering. It was mostly over kind of the additional growth of the civil rights movement, over the anti-war movement, and a lot of articles and books that were being published. And it was obviously alarming, because the history of Jews and Blacks working together during the civil rights movement, of course, was pretty well known.
Mine was from a different perspective. I didn't experience it as an undergrad. I really don't think I was aware of it, and that wasn't the time that it was happening. When I was the Hillel director, I didn't experience it directly. I'd hear about it from students. On the other hand, my intent was to try and find a way of being in contact with the non-Jewish faculty, and particularly the clergy, so that there was a conversation going on. That seemed, by the way, in my generation of rabbinic students, to be I guess the process that was recommended for dealing. So as I mentioned, that I had met the Arab student advisor, I ended up taking 3 courses with him on Islam. He was a Muslim, and but it allowed me to hear what his complaints were, and then by the same token, he heard mine. The other side was also with regard to the Christian clergy on campus, and to learn about that allowed me to be kind of a middle person. For instance, I didn't realize that the Mormons who came to campus my 3rd year, my last year, and built a foundation, actually catty corner from Hillel. The Christian churches did not want to recognize them as being Christians, let alone as being legitimate. And even when the ministers or the director's wife had an emergency surgery, and I said something about, wouldn't it be nice if we sent some flowers? The comment was, no, we don't do things like that. And it was because they were Mormons, I found out. So my perspective as the Hillel director was listening to students who felt like they were experiencing the kind of things David didn't happen to mention that to me, but that in the issue that there were students who thought those kind of things were happening. Question was, how do you respond to it? What's a good approach to dealing with it? But directly, that was not something that as the Hillel director I experienced. Although, as I laughingly said, the other campus ministers who were teaching Bible courses were very envious of the fact that Hillel was getting 200 students a semester. to take Bible, whereas they might get a total of 25 or 30 if they were lucky. And obviously most of the students were not Jewish.
Yeah. We're coming now to the end of the discussion, and I want to give each of you an opportunity to reflect on the career path you took when you left Austin, and to tell us about what you did, and to reflect a little bit also on how you think your time at UT shaped the Jewish communal professional that you became, starting with Lee.
Well, I mean, I'm going to make it very short, which is, if it weren't for Jimmy Kessler, I would not have pursued what I did. In my, I don't know, probably in the middle of my college years, I started working part-time for BBYO, having honestly, no idea what I was going to do. I started off as a business major. I hated it. I ended up moving into government, political science, and loved it. My parents fully expected me to go into some kind of business, either with my father in the schmata business or something else. And when I made this decision I started thinking about working as Jewish community professional, which I didn't know at the time existed. Jimmy was my coach and eventually convinced me that that was the path I should embark on. And not only should I embark on, at the time, the preferred degree for a Jewish community professional was social work. He guided me in the direction of a program that had just gotten started a few years before I graduated at Hebrew Union College. And of course, a big hurdle was my parents, who had this huge expectation that I was going to go into business. And Jimmy was my advocate with my parents. And honestly, the rest is history. I went to work for BBYO for a few years because of an obligation I had because of a scholarship they provided. And eventually I came back to Houston in 1978 and worked for BBYO another few years, and then landed at the Federation in 1987. And none of it would have happened without Jimmy.
That's great. Now let's hear from Nancy.
Well, I'm going to go back a little bit further and saying that the reason I felt so comfortable stepping into Hillel was because I had a really active Jewish life as a high school student through the Reform movement and Reform camps. That was very important to me and made me see that I loved being Jewish, that was really important. I always knew I wanted to be a teacher, and I just knew that was happening. And I don't think I ever realized that being a Jewish teacher, or a teacher of Judaism, was something that was that could earn me a career. And I don't remember specifically, but somehow or another, Jimmy, with somebody from HUC was there, or you talked to me about it. You showed me that there was a program in Jewish education that started with a year in Israel that was just beyond belief. And I was so excited about that. So by the time, I remember when I was accepted and into the program, I applied to it at the end of my senior year, which was my third year at UT. And I went to the rehearsed School of Education at HUC in Los Angeles. And that was it. That was my career choice. And but my time at Hillel gave me the opportunity. One of the things I remember doing was writing my application, talking about what they asked me some big questions about how it would affect the community. And one of the things I did was write about community education and being involved in cross movement activities as well. And that's something that has been important throughout my career as well, not just in the reform movement, because now I affiliate personally in the conservative movement, but that being able to draw from all parts of the Jewish world has been really important in my life. And I think that started at Hillel because that's what we did. So, but there's no question in my mind that, like Lee, I don't think I'd be where I was if it weren't for Jimmy.
Great. So Rabbi Rosen, tell us about your path after you left Austin. How did you know already that you wanted to become a rabbi while you were still a student?
No. I went to the University of Texas. Really, my story parallels Lee's. My father had a business, women's wear manufacturing company in Dallas. It was very successful, and the expectation was the partners that the sons, two oldest sons, would take over the business. And so the other partner's son was already in the business, and my dad was just waiting for me. And I just accepted that. It was a business. It was a good business. Why not go into that? And therefore, he said, you can major in anything you want at the university. He says, I don't care, because you're going to come work for me. So I decided to major in something that would be fun, I would enjoy, it'd be good. And so I majored in communications and with a concentration in journalism, which in those days, my campus days, meant print journalism, because television news was not really considered journalism. It was considered television. So it was a very positive experience. As it turned out, interestingly, journalism was a wonderful asset to me as a rabbi, because it trained me on how to meet deadlines. It trained me on how to structure my writing so that I always followed a flow that made whatever I wrote make sense. And it was clear to everybody to understand what I was writing about. So those skills came to me because of my training in journalism. But it wasn't really until Jimmy was at my end of my junior year or early part of my senior year, I don't remember. I was involved in Hillel and obviously the Jewish newspaper. So clearly I had a passion for Jewish life as well. But the idea of being a rabbi, no. One day Jimmy calls me into his office and he says, what are you going to do when you graduate? I said, I'm going to go work for my dad. He says, is that what you want to do? I said, well, I mean, that's what it is. He said, I think you should consider rabbinical school. And I couldn't have been more floored in my life to be confronted that way. And he handed me the catalog for the Hebrew Union College Rabbinical School. And, it's like this thick. And they had every course that they taught there for the whole 4 or 5 year curriculum. And I looked at the topics and titles. I couldn't even understand the class descriptions. I mean, they were. I thought that it was enough to know all the holidays, which I did, and I knew all the key figures in Jewish history, which I did, and I could read Hebrew and I could dive in real fast. So I thought that was about it. And then he shows me this whole massive 5-year postgraduate program, and I remember thinking 5 years. I wanted to get married. I had a girlfriend I was serious with. We ended up getting married, and he's setting me off on this 5-year, journey. But it was Jimmy who convinced me, convinced my parents, and really gave me my life. And it really enabled me to deepen my passion for Judaism, being Jewish, being a professional Jew. And for that, I will always be grateful to Jimmy. He's been with me ever since as my mentor and my teacher and my beloved friend and colleague. And it was the greatest thing I took from the University of Texas was that little nudge that led me in that direction. And I'll just postscript it by saying on a funny note that when I went to HJHA for my interview, and I came back that night, Jimmy called me and he asked me, how did it go? And I said, it went well. I said, have you heard anything? He said, yeah, you're in. I said, really? That fast? And he said, well, they're waiting on the psychiatric evaluation, but otherwise you're in. So yeah, I said, you mean if I don't get in, it's because I failed the psychiatric evaluation? And there was this the pause on the other end of the phone. He says, Well, anyway, thank God I passed the psychiatric evaluation, which they required the rabbinical students in those days, and made a career of it. And that's what I really will always be grateful to Jimmy for, Hillel for, and it really was the capstone to a wonderful 4 years at the University of Texas.
That's great. And Rabbi Rosen, you've gone back to your roots now as a Rabbi Emeritus at Beth Yeshurun. You're a newspaper columnist for the Jewish Herald Voice.
I am writing a column now for the Herald Voice, which is really nice. Right, I've been in congregations in New York and in Providence, Rhode Island, and when the opportunity came that Rabbi Jack Siegel announced his retirement, I still have a lot of family here in Houston, and all my family wrote and said, you got to apply, and I really was very hesitant, honestly. Not because I had any questions about Beth Yeshurun per se. It was just a wonderful, always has been a wonderful congregation, a leading congregation in the conservative movement. I didn't know first if I was up to the job, frankly. I was coming from a 600 family congregation to a 2,200 family congregation. As I learned later, there's no way you can actually be prepared to go into a large congregation like that. There's no stepping stone to it. Everybody comes from a smaller congregation. So it was that, first of all. Second of all, I was a graduate of Hebrew Union College, and Beth Yeshurun was a conservative synagogue, so I thought they would just dismiss me right away. It's not being up to their standard. And then I was afraid what it would do to my family, frankly, to have that kind of a responsibility to such a large congregation. And being in smaller congregations, you can spend a lot more time with your kids. I had just starting a family, and so it was a decision made with my wife's love and support and encouragement, and the congregation has always been very supportive and enabling me to have what I needed to continue living a life above and beyond what I do for the show. And now in retirement, they continue to be very good to me, and I have a very warm relationship with my successor. So it's been a wonderful career, and it all started with a conversation across the desk with the rabbi way long ago.
Great. So, Jimmy, the floor is yours. I know that your life and career path took some interesting twists and turns after UT, but you get the last word. Tell us about your life after leaving.
I want to begin by saying to you that these three folk, now at my age of 75, validate my career as a rabbi, and obviously as a dear friend, but particularly as a rabbi. I never was convinced I was very good at this. So after 3 years of Hillel and trying to raise money and so on, my uncle suggested I should go to optometry school because he had a practice that none of his kids were interested in. I lasted 3 days because I didn't realize how much math was involved in that, and I was terrible at math. And fortunately, there was a job open, and which led me ultimately to Galveston for a 5-year period. And then from Galveston, I dropped out for 7 years, thinking that I was going to make us rich selling insurance. And I didn't. But I realized after the first year that I missed the pulpit and I missed rabbiing. And so I went to Victoria, Texas for 6 years on a monthly basis and did services for them while we were living in Austin. And that was a lot of fun. And then Galveston came open again and called me and said, how would you like to come back to Galveston? And I did, and spent another 30 plus years, so that in total I've been around here now. I'm into my 38th year, if I get 4 years credit for retirement emeritus. I wanted to say that my motivation to all of this was because I had this crazy Hillel rabbi who didn't look like any other rabbi I ever met, and Mickey Sills wasn't quite as contrary as he later became, but it was enough to get me started. And then I was lucky enough to encounter people like Nancy and David and Lee over the years, not just in Hillel, but in Galveston and the other places that I was, that reminded me that ultimately being a rabbi was somehow or another trying to keep or to provide Jews with a way of being involved with their religious tradition. And whether that was teaching some kiddo how to put on tefillin, or it was coming up with some kind of program that would work. And all of that is predicated, I will tell you, on two things. One of them was that Tom Friedman and his wife Min ran a Jewish camp in Texas when there was no other Jewish camps in Texas, although Young Judea was beginning to be in existence at the time. And but the method behind their camp was that every kid was important, and that every kid's needs you needed to try and meet as a counselor. Then the next part was Hillel. And Hillel taught me a lot of things, taught me how to schnorr money, taught me how to budget, taught me how to be in control of a building, because it was me that made repairs when we couldn't afford somebody else to do them. And it introduced me to people who came of their own volition to find something in Judaism that would grab their attention. And I put those two together, and I look back on it and realize, that's kind of shaped me as a human being, as to whatever I've become and I've been able to achieve, which I, as I've said to you, I think is that smile of God on the fools, is that I've been lucky to be able to be there as there's a midrash that talks about the word goraim, Gimel Reish Vav Mem. And goraim, if you add up its numerical equivalent, its gematria is 249. And the suggestion of the Darshan who wrote that is that the standard tradition of 248 positive mitzvot, this is the 249th positive mitzvah, which is to help people achieve what they're seeking to achieve. And that always grabbed me as a way of functioning as a rabbi. And as I say, Hillel and my camping experience were the ones that shaped that. Also, I should tell you, I was a charter member of Shapiro ACA. I wrote myself a note that said, you need to put this in here somehow or another.
You snuck it in just under the wire.
Just at the last minute.
I want to thank each one of you for being a part of this conversation. It was so fascinating and such a special opportunity for us to be able to gather together. It's been a difficult year for so many people living through this pandemic, but one of the silver linings, I think, has been the opportunity to gather together and to do these interviews for the archive and to reminisce. And this was a really special one. And the credit for it really goes to Nancy, who first gave me the idea and the suggestion, and has been a wonderful volunteer for the archive in so many ways, as all of you have been so supportive of this work from the very beginning. And so I thank you for that. We've had a really special conversation today, and I'm looking forward to having people be able to watch this and learn from it for years to come. So thank you all very, very much.